She was sure she was just tired and imagining things. But the strange noises from the toilet kept getting louder, and no one believed her. Not her friends, not even the landlord. And when the truth finally came out, it was already too late. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The cab dropped her off in front of the narrow brick building just after sunset, when the streetlights flickered to life and the wind carried the scent of old pavement and rain. Nia Hudson stood there for a moment, her hands tightening around the handles of two overstuffed boxes, taken in the sight of the place that was supposed to mark a fresh start. The three-story house leaned slightly to one side, as if age had bent its spine. The iron railing on the steps was chipped, the front door's paint had faded into an unidentifiable brown, and the buzz of the streetlight above the entrance was louder than the faint music leaking from an upstairs window. It wasn't much, but it was hers, or at least hers for the foreseeable future. After the months she had spent scraping together enough money to leave her old life behind, anything that promised quiet and solitude felt like salvation. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of dust and detergent. The landlord had told her that the building dated back to the 1960s, and every detail confirmed it. The narrow corridor, lined with pipes that had been painted over too many times, seemed to carry the whispers of all its former tenants. Her new apartment was on the second floor at the very end of the hallway. When she pushed the door open, it released a sigh of stale air, as if the room had been waiting too long to be lived in again. The first thing she noticed was how small it was. Just a living room that merged into a kitchenette, a single bedroom, and a bathroom barely wide enough for one person. The walls were painted off-white but yellowed towards the corners, and the faint hum of an old refrigerator echoed through the space like a heartbeat. She set down her boxes and looked around, trying to imagine herself living here. After the chaos of the past year, the breakup, the move across town, the endless overtime shifts at the community center, this was supposed to be a reset. The rent was affordable, the neighborhood was quiet, and she didn't know anyone nearby. That last part was both comforting and lonely. She unpacked slowly, taking her time with each object, folding clothes into drawers that stuck when pulled, arranging her few books on the window ledge where a curtain rod was missing. It was strange how silence could make even the smallest sounds feel amplified. The clink of her mug against the counter, the creak of the floor under her steps, the distant hum of a passing bus. She liked quiet, but tonight it pressed too close, heavy and unfamiliar. By the time she finished, it was nearly midnight. Nia made herself a cup of tea and walked toward the bathroom to brush her teeth. The light there was harsher, fluorescent, throwing every imperfection of the space into view. Cracked tiles, old grout, the mirror mottled at the edges. She noticed that the toilet was an older model, with a rounded porcelain tank and a silver flush button on top that looked slightly tarnished. When she pressed it, it stuck for a moment before releasing, and the water made a low gurgling sound that went on longer than expected. She frowned, but the fatigue of the day was stronger than curiosity. She told herself that in old buildings things always made noise. Pipes, heaters, walls shifting with the temperature. It was nothing. That night she slept fitfully, half aware of the apartment around her. At one point she woke up, convinced that she'd heard a faint tapping sound. It was soft, rhythmic, coming from the direction of the bathroom. She lay still, listening, her heart beating faster with each second of silence between the noises. Maybe it was dripping water, she thought. Maybe the tank was leaking or air trapped in the pipes. She rolled over and forced her eyes shut. Tomorrow she would check. It wasn't worth getting up for. The next morning, sunlight poured through the slats of the blinds, illuminating the dust floating lazily in the air. Nia brewed coffee and tried not to think about the night before. She told herself that she had imagined it. New places always felt strange at first. Still, when she went into the bathroom again, she paused. The smell of dampness was stronger, though there was no visible leak. She pressed the flush button once more. It resisted again before moving. The water hissed for a moment, then quieted. There was a short clicking sound afterward, almost like someone had pressed a recorder's button in another room. She tilted her head, frowning, but the sound had already faded. Shrugging it off, she washed her hands, staring at her reflection. She looked tired but alert, her dark skin glowing under the harsh light, curls tied loosely at the back of her head. She smiled faintly to herself, trying to convince her reflection that she was fine. The day passed without incident. She spent the afternoon cleaning and rearranging, opening the windows to let the air move through. From outside came the sounds of ordinary life. A dog barking, a radio playing somewhere below, a child's laughter carried up the stairwell. The normalcy of it steadied her. By evening, she was feeling almost comfortable in her new home. She made dinner, simple pasta, eaten from a bowl on the couch, and scrolled through messages on her phone. Friends sent photos from the city center. Her ex had finally stopped calling, and for the first time in months, she felt the edges of peace returning. When she went to bed, she left the bathroom light on. She told herself it was just because she didn't like waking up in total darkness, but in truth, she didn't want to hear anything unexpected again. Light, she thought, would keep the apartment quiet. Sometime after midnight, a soft sound broke the silence. It wasn't tapping this time, but a faint, rhythmic hum like the static between radio stations. Nia stirred, disoriented. The glow from the bathroom light stretched across the floor, forming a narrow path of pale gold. She sat up, listening. The hum came and went, a low vibration that seemed to travel through the walls. Maybe the upstairs neighbor was watching television, she thought. Maybe someone's heater had switched on. Yet the sound was too localized, too deliberate. It pulsed faintly, then stopped, then pulsed again. A pattern. She got out of bed, walked barefoot toward the bathroom, and stood in the doorway. The light reflected off the porcelain, giving the small space a sterile, almost hospital-like brightness. The sound was louder now, definitely coming from the toilet. She bent slightly, pressing her ear closer to the tank. It was cold to the touch. Inside, she could hear a faint crackling, then what might have been a single click, sharp and metallic. She straightened up, heart thudding, and forced herself to laugh. "Old pipes," she whispered. "Always old pipes." She flushed again, just to drown out the noise, and for a few seconds the rush of water made everything seem normal. The next morning, she woke later than usual. Sunlight filled the room, but her body felt heavy, as if she hadn't truly slept. She moved through her morning routine automatically. Coffee, toast, shower, but the bathroom felt different now. Every sound was sharper. The rush of the faucet seemed too loud, the echo of her toothbrush against the sink too crisp. When she pressed the flush again, it caught just as before, grinding slightly before releasing. There was that same mechanical hesitation, followed by the short, inexplicable click. This time, it irritated her more than it frightened her. She muttered under her breath and decided to call the landlord later to ask for repair. Work distracted her for most of the day. She was a community liaison at a local nonprofit, used to handling people's frustrations more than her own. The noise from the toilet seemed laughably small compared to the real problems she dealt with: unpaid bills, broken promises, lives unraveling. Still, when she returned home that evening and stepped into the quiet apartment, the memory of the sound returned as a whisper of unease. She poured herself a glass of wine, turned on some music, and tried to ignore the thought that the bathroom was waiting for her, that somewhere inside those walls something was ticking, like a clock counting down to something unnamed. Later, as she brushed her teeth before bed, she stared at the mirror again. The reflection of the light fixture above her head shimmered faintly in the glass. For a moment, she thought she saw movement behind her, a shift of shadow near the toilet, but when she turned around, nothing was there. Only the soft hiss of water settling in the pipes. She laughed again, this time more nervously, and whispered to herself that she was just tired. Still, before turning off the light, she pressed her hand on the toilet lid, making sure it was closed tight. The cold porcelain under her palm felt strangely alive. That night, she dreamed of echoes. In her sleep, she was back in her old apartment, packing boxes, but each time she taped one shut, a faint knocking came from inside it. When she opened them, there was nothing but water trickling down the sides, forming thin streams that disappeared into the floorboards. She woke up gasping, heart racing, sweat on her skin. The bathroom light was still on. The apartment was silent. For a long time she lay there, staring at the pale square of light on the ceiling, wondering if the dream had borrowed its rhythm from the sounds she'd been hearing all along. Days slipped by. The city outside moved with its usual indifference, and Nia began to adjust to the peculiarities of her new home. Yet, each night, when the building grew quiet and the neighbors' footsteps faded, she could hear it again, faint, steady, just on the edge of perception. A click, a pause, a hum. She would hold her breath, listening, then shake her head and pull the blanket over her ears. Whatever it was, she thought, she'd learn to live with it. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of reason and fatigue, a single, unshakable thought began to form, that the sound wasn't random. It was waiting for her to listen more closely. Morning light softened the edges of the apartment, but the calm it brought was fragile. Nia sat at the small kitchen table with a mug of coffee, watching the steam rise and swirl. Outside, traffic hummed and someone shouted across the street. But even amid those familiar city sounds, she could still sense the faintest rhythm beneath it all, as though the apartment itself had found a pulse. She tried to ignore it, telling herself she had finally settled in. But when she went to wash her cup in the sink, she caught it again. 3 short clicks, a pause, then 2 more. They came from the bathroom. She froze, hand halfway to the faucet. For several seconds she held her breath, waiting for another sound, but there was nothing. When she finally exhaled, she laughed quietly, shaking her head. Old pipes, she reminded herself again. Always old pipes. At work, she forced the memory from her mind. The day was long and filled with faces and paperwork, and by evening she was grateful for the thought of solitude. Yet, when she opened her apartment door, that same thick stillness greeted her, carrying with it a faint smell of moisture that hadn't been there before. She dropped her bag and shoes by the door and went straight to the bathroom. Everything looked normal. The pale tiles, the neatly folded towel, the mirror still streaked from last night's condensation. But when she pressed the flush button, it caught again, harder this time, and she felt the resistance under her fingertip like a muscle tensing. The water released with a groan, and deep inside the wall something shifted, followed by a low metallic tap that traveled down the pipe. She stood very still. The sound reminded her of someone tapping the end of a pen against a desk, slow and thoughtful. That night, the sound returned stronger than before. It began around midnight, a faint stuttering at first, then a steady rhythm. She lay in bed, eyes open in the dark, counting the beats. The pattern was too regular to be random. 3 taps, a pause, then one longer vibration. Again, again. It was almost mechanical, but there was something strangely human about it too, something deliberate. She turned on the lamp and sat up. Maybe a neighbor shared the same plumbing line and this was just the echo of their midnight routine. She got out of bed, walked barefoot to the bathroom and leaned against the cold tile wall, listening. The sound stopped. She waited, holding her breath. Nothing. When she turned away, the flush button clicked once, all by itself. Sleep became restless. She dreamed of wires curling through the walls like veins, of whispering static behind the pipes. Each morning, she awoke with the taste of metal on her tongue and the unease of not knowing if the noises had been real. By the 4th night, the clicking had become a part of the apartment's soundtrack, blending with the hum of the refrigerator and the distant city traffic. Only when everything else fell silent could she hear it clearly again, that strange pulse in the darkness. She tried distractions. Music filled the rooms, podcasts played as she cooked, but she could never escape the awareness of that hidden sound. On Sunday afternoon, she turned everything off and decided to face it directly. She filled the sink, flushed the toilet, turned on the shower, testing how the noise responded. Each time she ran water, the sound softened but didn't vanish. When she turned everything off again, it returned louder, pulsing from somewhere deep behind the porcelain tank. She placed her palm flat against it. The surface was cold and damp with condensation, but beneath it she thought she felt a faint tremor, as though something inside the wall vibrated in response to her touch. She stepped back quickly, her heart hammering. That evening, she called her landlord. The call lasted barely 2 minutes. He told her the plumbing was old, the building had been renovated years ago, and such noises were part of the charm. When she tried to explain that this was different, that it felt like something mechanical, he laughed. "You'll get used to it," he said and hung up. For a while, she sat staring at her phone, her reflection flickering in the black screen. Used to it. The words settled on her like dust. As night fell, she noticed new sounds joining the old. Along with the clicking, there were now faint bursts of static, the sort of short-lived crackle she remembered from her father's radio when he tuned between stations. Sometimes it lasted a few seconds, sometimes less. The noise seemed to react to her movements, growing louder when she entered the bathroom, fading when she left. Once, she thought she heard a fragment of speech buried in the distortion, a single syllable that might have been her name, but when she leaned closer, there was only silence again. Her rational mind fought against fear. She researched toilet noises and clicking pipes online, scrolling through countless forums filled with theories about trapped air, sediment buildup, and loose valves. She tried them all. She flushed with the lid open, checked the back of the tank, even poured vinegar into the system as one post suggested. For a few hours it seemed to help. But around midnight the sound returned, sharper and quicker, as though irritated by her interference. Sleep no longer brought rest. She would lie awake, listening to the patterns evolve, sometimes a single repetitive tick, sometimes a rising hiss followed by silence. The worst was when it seemed to imitate rhythm, like a coded sequence, or like breathing. Each new variation deepened her anxiety. Once she caught herself whispering to it, asking it to stop, and immediately felt ridiculous. She was talking to plumbing. Still, the instant she spoke, there had been an answering click. By Monday, she was exhausted. At work, she spilled coffee on a report and forgot a client's name mid-sentence. Her coworker laughed gently and said she looked haunted. Nia forced a smile, but later, in the bathroom at work, she stood by the sink staring at the tiles, terrified she might hear the same sound there too. When she came home that night, the apartment seemed to greet her with a low murmur, the familiar cadence behind the bathroom door. The smell of damp metal lingered stronger than ever. She pressed her ear to the wall again, feeling foolish but unable to resist. Behind the tile came a faint electrical buzz, then a sudden sharp click so close it made her flinch. She stepped back and stared at the toilet as though it might move. Then, slowly, she crouched and examined every inch, the pipes, the screws, the floor beneath it. That was when she noticed the smallest detail. Near the back of the tank, just above the baseboard, a hairline crack in the plaster that hadn't been there before. She touched it with her fingertip. The surface crumbled slightly, leaving a smear of gray dust. For a moment, she thought she saw something dark behind it, like a thread or a wire, but when she blinked it was gone. She stood up quickly and backed away, heart racing. Maybe the sound was air, maybe it was a leak inside the wall, but maybe it wasn't. She spent the rest of the evening pacing the apartment, too restless to sit, too afraid to leave. When the noise started again that night, she turned on every light, hoping brightness would chase it away. It didn't. The clicks came softer now, deliberate, as if waiting for her to notice. At 3 a.m, she gave up on sleep and sat at her table with a notebook. She began writing down the times she heard the sounds, drawing small marks to track their rhythm. It felt absurd at first, but soon she realized there was a pattern. The noises often began around midnight, paused after 3, then started again around 5. She noted the intervals, the variations in tone, the moments of silence. It wasn't random. It was too controlled, too intentional. She stared at the paper, her pulse pounding in her ears, and for the first time, a new thought took hold. What if someone was trying to listen? The idea made her laugh aloud in the empty room. Who would hide in a bathroom wall? Still, she couldn't dismiss it. The crack she'd found, the hidden wire she thought she saw, it all fit together in a way that logic couldn't untangle. She took out her phone and tried to record the sound again. Holding the microphone near the tank, she waited. There was nothing for several seconds, then one faint pop followed by static. She replayed it immediately, but the recording captured only the faint rush of air. Whatever the noise was, it didn't want to be recorded. The next morning, the world looked the same, but Nia no longer trusted it. The walls of her apartment seemed to watch her as she moved. When she brushed her teeth, she caught herself glancing at the mirror's reflection, expecting movement behind her. Each time she flushed, she listened for that click. It never failed her. It had become, she realized, part of her daily life, as steady as her heartbeat. And deep down, she felt that whatever caused it was listening too. One evening, as the sun sank and shadows reached across the floor, she sat by the bathroom door with her back against the wall, waiting. The apartment was utterly still. For the first time, she thought she could hear the city breathing outside, the wind against the windows, the distant hum of traffic. Then, faintly, from behind her, came that same mechanical whisper, rhythmic and patient. It didn't frighten her this time. Instead, it filled her with a strange certainty. Someone, somewhere behind that wall, was waiting for her to respond. When the sound finally stopped, the silence it left behind was heavier than the noise itself. She rose slowly, feeling as if the entire apartment were holding its breath. Then she turned off the light and walked away, pretending that everything was normal. But inside her, a quiet dread settled deeper, as if a small door had opened that could never quite be closed again. For days after that long night, Nia carried the tension of her apartment inside her body as if it had fused with her bones. Each morning began with the same quiet dread, a moment before she opened her eyes when she could almost believe that nothing was wrong, that she had imagined it all. But then she would hear the faint echo of dripping water somewhere deep in the pipes, a soft knock that was too deliberate to ignore, and the sense of intrusion would return like a weight pressing on her chest. At work, she forced herself to smile, to listen, to care about the endless stream of small human troubles that came through her office, but part of her mind remained anchored in that bathroom, haunted by the rhythm she could not explain. The sound had taken root not just in her walls but in her mind, a presence that waited patiently for her to come home each night. She began to feel watched. It was not a single clear feeling, not paranoia that announced itself outright, but something quieter, more insidious. When she brushed her hair before the mirror, she sometimes had the eerie sense that her reflection wasn't perfectly aligned with her movements, that there was a fraction of delay between her turning her head and the mirrored version following. She told herself she was overtired, and perhaps she was, because sleep had become impossible. Each night she would lie awake listening for that familiar pulse in the pipes, the one that seemed to grow stronger when she stopped breathing, as if waiting for her to notice it. Sometimes she got up and went to the bathroom, switching on the light just to reassure herself that everything was in its place. It always was. Nothing moved, nothing changed, yet she could not shake the certainty that the apartment was listening to her too. One morning, she found herself standing in front of the bathroom door for almost 5 minutes, unable to go in. The door itself looked harmless, white paint, brass handle slightly tarnished, but beyond it lay that quiet, patient noise that had started to feel like an entity of its own. She forced herself inside, her movements slow and deliberate, and faced the toilet. She pressed the flush button, and, as expected, it stuck again before yielding. The sound that followed was now unmistakable, not just water moving through pipes, but a click, a faint whir, and then a second click. It was almost mechanical, like a device turning itself on. She stared at the porcelain tank, heart pounding, and reached out to lift the lid. Her fingers stopped just before touching it. She didn't know what she expected to find: mold, rust, perhaps a loose valve, but something inside her screamed not to look. She replaced her hand, took a step back, and tried to breathe. That day, she brought home a small portable recorder she used for interviews at work. If the sound existed, she reasoned, she could capture it. She placed it on the edge of the sink before bed and turned it on, its small red light blinking like a heartbeat in the dark. Then she turned off the lights and tried to sleep. The clicks began around the same time as always, steady, faint, and unmistakable. She pulled the covers over her head, refusing to listen. When morning came, she replayed the recording. What she heard was mostly silence, broken occasionally by the soft rush of water, the sound of her own movements in the night. The clicks were gone. The recorder had caught nothing. Her throat tightened as she listened again and again, searching for any sign that she hadn't imagined it. But there was only stillness. The apartment, it seemed, refused to confess. Over the next few nights, her fear began to erode into a kind of dull exhaustion. She moved through her days mechanically, her mind wrapped in fog. Her coworkers started to notice. "You look pale," one of them said. "Are you sleeping at all?" Nia smiled, made a joke about caffeine, and went back to work. She didn't tell anyone the truth because she wasn't sure what the truth was anymore. If she said it aloud, that she thought there was something behind the walls of her bathroom listening to her, she would sound unhinged. So she stayed silent and returned each night to the quiet that waited for her. The apartment had begun to change too, or at least it seemed that way to her. The air felt heavier, more humid, carrying the faint metallic tang of old water. Sometimes she thought she smelled something like burnt plastic near the bathroom, just for a second before it vanished. She opened the window to air it out, but the odor returned, fleeting but persistent. When she touched the walls, she thought she could feel a faint vibration, like the heartbeat of the building itself. Once, she pressed her ear against the tile and heard something that wasn't a click or a drip, but a whisper of movement, the faint shifting of something alive within the wall. She recoiled, stumbling backward, then stood staring at the wall, her pulse racing. The bathroom, once merely uncomfortable, had become unbearable. She told herself she would call a plumber, a real one this time, not rely on the landlord's dismissive reassurances. But the thought of explaining the problem made her hesitate. How could she describe it? That her toilet made noises like a recorder? That sometimes she thought she could hear a whisper under the sound of the flush? That she had seen a wire, or thought she had, behind the plaster? She decided to wait until she had something solid, some proof. So she began to keep a written record again, marking down every time she heard the noise, the hour, its rhythm, its intensity. She became meticulous, almost scientific. Yet the more data she gathered, the less sense it made. The sounds came at irregular intervals, but always at night, always when she was alone. It was as if the noise knew when she was listening. One evening, she noticed something new. After flushing, as the water settled, she heard a faint click followed by a second one a few seconds later. Then silence. She tried again, pressing the button harder this time. The pattern repeated. Click. Pause. Click. It reminded her of a switch being thrown somewhere, something mechanical, engaging, and then disengaging. She bent closer, heart racing, and whispered, "What are you?" The silence that followed was so deep that her own breathing seemed deafening. Then, faintly, came a single, deliberate tick in reply. Her hands shook. She left the bathroom and sat in the living room with the lights off, trying to steady herself. The apartment's shadows pressed close around her, and for the first time she began to wonder if she should leave. But leave for where? She had nowhere else to go, no family nearby, and she couldn't afford another place. Besides, she told herself, if she ran from this, it would follow her. It wasn't about the apartment anymore. It was about her, about what she had begun to believe. The idea that something could be listening through the pipes had taken hold like a sickness, and even if she left, the fear would come with her. That night, she dreamed of standing in front of a mirror, the bathroom light flickering behind her. In the reflection, the toilet lid slowly rose by itself, revealing not water, but darkness, a deep, endless void from which a soft static poured like breath. She woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. The light in the bathroom was still on, steady and cold. The lid was closed, but the faint smell of burnt plastic hung in the air again, stronger this time. The next morning, she noticed something strange. Around the base of the toilet, near where the pipes met the floor, the tiles were slightly damp. The moisture formed a perfect semicircle, glistening under the light. She wiped it away with a towel, but when she returned an hour later, it had reappeared. The water wasn't leaking from above, it seemed to be seeping from beneath. She knelt, pressing her hand to the floor, and thought she felt a faint warmth there, unnatural for cold ceramic. She whispered aloud, "This isn't right," and the sound of her own voice in the quiet apartment startled her. Later that day, she brought home a small tool set and decided to check the baseboard near the toilet. She unscrewed the paneling carefully, prying it away just enough to see the dark space behind it. A thin crack ran along the wall, the same one she had touched days earlier, and from inside it came a faint hum, steady and low. She turned off all other sounds in the apartment and leaned closer. The hum wasn't random. It pulsed, rhythmic, almost electrical. Then came the click again, right behind her ear, so sudden and close that she gasped and dropped the screwdriver. When she looked again, the hum was gone. Her hands were shaking as she reattached the baseboard. She sat on the bathroom floor for a long time, staring at the toilet, trying to gather the courage to do what she had been avoiding, to lift the lid and look inside. But she couldn't. The thought filled her with an instinctive terror she couldn't explain, as though whatever was hidden there was meant to stay hidden. She stood up slowly, her legs trembling, and closed the door. From that day on, she kept it closed whenever possible, as if by shutting it she could contain whatever was happening inside. But closing the door didn't stop the noise. It grew more unpredictable, coming at odd hours, sometimes in the middle of the afternoon when she least expected it. She began to hear it faintly, even from the other rooms, a series of taps and whispers that followed her like a pulse through the walls. It was everywhere now, inside the pipes, beneath the floor, behind the thin layer of paint that separated her from whatever lurked beyond. She felt trapped in a house that was no longer hers, a house that had learned the sound of her heartbeat. Her reflection had changed too. Each morning, when she looked in the mirror, her eyes seemed slightly different, more hollow, as if she had been hollowed out from the inside. She caught herself talking aloud just to fill the silence, narrating her morning routine in a low voice like a child afraid of the dark. Once she laughed at herself for it, but the laughter sounded strange in the empty apartment, and she stopped. By the end of the week, she was certain of one thing: the noise wasn't an accident. It responded. She tested it one night by clapping her hands twice in quick succession, then waiting. From behind the bathroom door came two soft clicks in answer. She froze, every muscle in her body tightening. She clapped again, one short, one long. The reply mirrored her exactly. She stared at the door, unable to move. Something, or someone, was listening from the other side. The realization hit her with cold clarity. This was no broken pipe, no trick of old plumbing. Someone had access to her walls. The thought terrified her so deeply that for a long time she couldn't think at all. She moved through the next day in a daze, her mind looping through the possibilities. Was it the landlord? A neighbor? Some stranger with access to the building's infrastructure? She had no evidence, no proof to give anyone. Only the sound. Only the quiet, deliberate sound that matched her like an echo. That evening, when it started again, she didn't hide under the covers or turn on the light. She sat on the bed, listening, counting each click until dawn. By morning, her eyes burned from sleeplessness, but her fear had hardened into resolve. Whatever it was behind those walls, she would find it. And she would not run. Morning came without light. The clouds hung low and gray outside her window, pressing against the glass as if the world itself had grown heavy. Nia stood in front of the mirror, a toothbrush dangling forgotten in her hand, staring at her reflection. Her eyes were rimmed with red, her skin pale under the harsh light. She had slept barely 2 hours, and even that short rest had been filled with the same noise, the clicks, the tapping, the coded rhythms that now echoed in her dreams. She turned off the faucet and listened. Silence. For the first time in days, she couldn't hear it. The stillness made her even more uneasy than the sound ever had. She left the apartment early, unable to stand the weight of its silence. Outside, the air smelled of wet concrete and car exhaust. The street was already awake, the hum of traffic rising and falling like breath. For a few hours, the noise of the city drowned out everything else. At the community center, her co-workers were cheerful, the chatter of morning routine surrounding her like a shield. But underneath that layer of normalcy, her mind kept replaying the same thought. Something was inside her wall. Not a ghost, not a superstition, something real, physical, deliberate. That certainty grew heavier each time she tried to suppress it. She told herself she was imagining things, yet she could no longer ignore the rhythm she had heard responding to her own movements. The memory of that mirrored pattern of sound, 2 clicks for 2 claps, still chilled her when she thought about it. By lunchtime, she had made a decision. She would bring someone in, someone who understood plumbing and pipes and all the hidden anatomy of old buildings. A professional would find the cause, and then she could stop feeling hunted in her own home. When her shift ended, she called the number of a local repair service she found online and booked a same-day appointment. The man on the other end sounded tired but polite, promising to arrive within the hour. Relief flooded through her. Finally, someone else would hear it too. Someone who wouldn't laugh. The plumber arrived just before dusk, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s with weary eyes and a toolbox that clanked when he set it down. His name was Mr. Adler, and he had the steady, methodical air of someone who'd been called to fix 100 variations of the same problem. Nia led him to the bathroom, explaining the noise as best she could. She tried to keep her voice calm, matter-of-fact, but she heard the tremor in it anyway. He nodded politely, his face giving nothing away, and began his inspection. The small space filled with the sound of his movements, metal tools clinking, the lid of the tank lifting, the dull scrape of his wrench against the pipes. She stood in the doorway, trying to read his expression, hoping for a sign of recognition. After a few minutes, he straightened and wiped his hands. "Everything looks fine," he said. The words dropped like stones into the quiet. "Old system. A little rust, maybe, but nothing unusual." Nia stared at him. "You didn't hear it?" He shrugged. "Just the usual pipe noises. Happens when the pressure fluctuates." "But it's not just pipes," she said quickly. "It's different. It responds. It makes sounds when I move." He gave her a patient smile, a kind reserved for people who worry too much. "You'd be surprised how sound carries in buildings like this. You hear one thing, and it feels like it's right behind you when it's just a neighbor upstairs." He replaced the tank lid and packed his tools. The faint smell of oil and metal filled the air. Nia wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. He thanked her, gave her a copy of the invoice, and left. The apartment felt smaller once the door closed behind him. For a few minutes, she stood in the hallway, clutching the paper in her hand, and listened. Silence. Then, from the bathroom, a single, unmistakable click. Her knees went weak. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, deliberate, and far too perfectly timed to be coincidence. She walked slowly toward the sound, each step measured, her breath shallow. When she reached the doorway, she froze. The plumber's inspection had left the toilet tank spotless, yet the faintest trace of moisture now glistened along its rim. She leaned closer, and the clicking stopped. Then came a new sound, a soft electrical hum, steady and low. It pulsed for a few seconds, then vanished. She spent that night in the living room, unable to bring herself to enter the bathroom again. The apartment's stillness pressed in on her, and the faint hum of the refrigerator became the only sound she could trust. Around midnight, she thought she heard something scraping faintly through the wall, a noise like wire being pulled through a narrow space. Her heart raced, but she didn't move. She sat perfectly still until dawn, her body stiff, her eyes fixed on the crack of light under the bathroom door. When morning came, she realized she could no longer live like this. Fear was starting to feel like part of her, shaping every breath. She decided to face it directly. If no one else could hear it, she would find out for herself what was behind those walls. She waited until afternoon when sunlight filled the room and made the shadows seem less threatening. She gathered what tools she had: an old screwdriver, a flashlight, a small kitchen knife, and knelt by the crack she had noticed earlier near the base of the wall. Her hands trembled as she wedged the tip of the screwdriver into the plaster and began to chip away. The sound was rough, scraping, almost too loud after days of soft clicks. Dust fell around her knees. The first layer broke away easily, revealing darkness behind it. For a moment, she hesitated. The air that seeped out of the crack was colder than the room, carrying a faint metallic odor. She directed the beam of her flashlight into the gap. Something glinted there, a thin strand of black cable running vertically through the wall, coated in dust. She reached for it, but the cable was too deep to pull free. She followed its path with her light, watching it disappear upward into the darkness. Every instinct told her to stop, but curiosity overpowered fear. Someone had installed that wire deliberately. Someone had tampered with the plumbing, perhaps connected it to something unseen. Her thoughts spiraled. A surveillance device, a listening wire, something hidden where no one would ever look. The idea was so wild it almost made her laugh, but the laughter died before it reached her lips. Because deep down, she knew it wasn't absurd. It was possible, and that possibility chilled her more than anything else. She cleaned up the fragments of plaster as best she could, then went straight to her phone. For a long time she just stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the keypad. Who could she call? The landlord would dismiss her again. The plumber had already shrugged it off. The police would need evidence, and what could she show them? A wire in a wall. The thought of explaining it made her stomach twist. Finally, she took a photo of the wire and saved it, telling herself she'd decide later what to do. As she set the phone down, she realized her hands were still shaking. That evening, the noise began again. It was softer now, intermittent, almost hesitant. She found herself talking to it without realizing. "I know you're there," she whispered. "Why?" The sound paused, then gave a single short click, almost like acknowledgement. The skin on her arms prickled. She turned on every light in the apartment and sat in the kitchen, forcing herself not to look toward the bathroom door. The brightness made the silence bearable, but her thoughts refused to rest. Someone could be using that wire to listen, maybe to watch. Every conversation, every private moment, recorded. The idea made her nauseous. The next day she called the landlord again, this time more forcefully. He answered with his usual impatience. When she mentioned finding a wire in the wall, his tone changed, nervous now. He said he would send someone to inspect, but days passed and no one came. She called again. This time he didn't answer. By the third attempt, his number went straight to voicemail. The sense of isolation deepened until it felt absolute. She had become a problem to be ignored. Nia's rational mind began to unravel under the weight of her fear. Every sound in the apartment seemed suspect: the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant laughter from upstairs, all of it folded into one continuous pattern of threat. She started unplugging electronics at night, convinced they might be compromised too. Her phone stayed off whenever she wasn't using it. When she walked through the apartment, she moved silently, listening. The noise came less often now, but that only made it worse, as if whoever or whatever was behind it had learned patience. A week passed like that. Then, one night, she woke to the faint sound of the toilet flushing by itself. The noise was unmistakable, the rush of water filling the tank. She froze, unable to move, her body rigid beneath the covers. After a few seconds, the flushing stopped. Silence. Then came the slow, deliberate creak of the bathroom door opening. She couldn't see it from where she lay, but she could feel it, the shift in the air, the change in the light. Her heart hammered so violently she thought it might burst. She waited, holding her breath, but nothing followed. When she finally dared to move, she turned on the lamp and saw that the bathroom door was exactly as she'd left it, closed. The sound had been only in her head, or perhaps in the walls. She couldn't tell any more. The next morning, she made another decision. She couldn't trust herself, but she could still trust evidence. She went out and bought a small motion sensor and a cheap recording device from a hardware store. If something moved or made noise in that bathroom while she slept, she would know. She set the devices carefully, positioning the sensor by the doorway and the recorder on the sink. Then she left the light on and went to bed. Sleep came in short bursts, broken by dreams of wires crawling through walls, of eyes watching from drains. At dawn, she woke and checked the devices. The motion sensor had triggered twice during the night. The recording was 6 minutes long. Her hands trembled as she pressed play. At first, there was only the faint hiss of ambient sound, the creak of the building settling. Then came the click, the same deliberate sound she had heard so many times before. Another followed, softer. Then something new, a faint scraping, like metal against metal, followed by a muffled thud. She listened to the entire recording twice before stopping. It wasn't her imagination. There was movement in that room while she slept. She called the police that afternoon. Her voice shook as she explained everything: the sounds, the wire, the recording. To her surprise, they didn't laugh. 2 officers arrived that evening, checked the bathroom, and asked questions she could barely answer. They found nothing obvious. No signs of forced entry, no tampering around the toilet. When she showed them the photo of the wire, one of the officers frowned and said it might be a part of an old alarm system. They left with polite words and no promises. After they were gone, the apartment seemed to close in around her again, heavier than before. That night, she didn't sleep at all. She sat in the living room with her back to the wall, the motion sensor glowing faintly from across the room. At 2 a.m, it blinked once, then twice. Her breath caught. From behind the bathroom door came the low hum of something electrical coming to life. She stood, frozen, waiting for the next sound. It came, a slow, deliberate click that echoed through the silence like the tick of a clock. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Instead, she whispered to herself again and again, "Tomorrow I'll leave." But she didn't. Not that night. Not yet. By the next morning, exhaustion had become a living thing that followed Nia through every room of her apartment. Her eyes ached, her hands trembled when she reached for her coffee mug, and every heartbeat felt like an echo inside her skull. The night's sounds, the motion sensor blinking, the faint mechanical hum, still rang in her memory, too clear to dismiss as imagination. She wanted to run, to pack a bag and leave everything behind, but leaving meant admitting she had lost control. It meant surrendering her home to whatever hid within it. And so she stayed, clutching at the fragile logic that if she could just find the source, just uncover one tangible thing, the fear would finally dissolve. That morning, she told herself, she would find it. The air in the bathroom was colder than the rest of the apartment, sharp with the scent of metal and bleach. She turned off the light and stood quietly in the doorway, listening. For a long time, nothing stirred. The silence was so complete it made her ears ring. Then came the faintest noise, a dry, crackling whisper, like static through a radio that couldn't find its signal. It was coming from inside the toilet tank again, behind the porcelain shell that had become the heart of her dread. Nia crossed the small room and touched the lid. It was cool beneath her fingers, smooth and slick with condensation. The memory of every click, every whisper, every sleepless night surged up inside her. She took a breath, braced herself, and lifted the lid. The sound grew louder the moment the porcelain shifted. Not a click this time, but a soft electrical hum that rose and fell with uneven rhythm. She peered inside and saw nothing unusual at first. Water rippling gently, the metal arm of the flush mechanism gleaming faintly in the dim light. But then, at the far corner of the tank, something caught her eye. A thin, black line barely visible beneath the surface. It looked like a thread or a root, embedded in the inner wall of the tank, almost invisible under the layer of grime. Her pulse quickened. She leaned closer, using the flashlight from her phone. The beam glinted off the curve of something metallic, no thicker than a pencil lead, wrapped in a thin sheath of dark plastic. It disappeared into a small hole near the base of the tank, perfectly round, too precise to be corrosion. It wasn't part of the plumbing. It was something else entirely. Her mouth went dry. The rational part of her brain tried to explain it away. A sensor, perhaps, some remnant of an old leak detection system. But another part, the part that had listened to those unnatural sounds night after night, whispered the truth she already knew. This wire did not belong there. She wanted to scream, but fear pinned her in place. Slowly, she reached for the wire. It moved beneath her touch, just slightly, as if something tugged it from the other side of the wall. She yanked her hand back and stumbled away, the lid clattering onto the floor. The sound shattered the stillness like glass. The hum stopped. For a long time, she stood there, shaking. The only sound was her own breathing. Finally, she forced herself to kneel beside the tank again. The wire was still there, glistening faintly in the light, unmoving now. She took out her phone and snapped a photo, then another from a different angle. The act of documenting it brought her a strange, fragile relief, proof that it existed, that she wasn't losing her mind. But proof wasn't enough. She needed someone else to see it, someone who could confirm what she already feared. She called the police again. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but she forced herself to stay calm, describing everything: the noise, the wire, the strange electrical sound. The dispatcher's tone was neutral, professional, but when she mentioned the possibility of surveillance, there was a pause before he told her an officer would come by later that day. Nia hung up and sank onto the edge of the bathtub, her legs weak. The waiting was worse than the noise. Every minute felt like an hour, every sound from the hallway a warning. She kept glancing toward the door, half expecting someone to burst through it, or for another click to sound from the tank. The officer arrived in the late afternoon. He was young, polite, his uniform still crisp. He listened carefully as she explained everything again, then followed her into the bathroom. When he lifted the lid of the tank and saw the wire, his expression changed. He didn't mock her or dismiss her concern. Instead, he leaned closer, inspecting it with the flashlight from his belt. "You're right," he said quietly. "That's not standard." The words sent a shiver through her. He traced the wire with his finger, following it to where it disappeared into the wall. "Could be electrical," he murmured, though his voice lacked conviction. "We'll have to call in someone who knows plumbing and wiring." An hour later, another man arrived, a technician with a handheld sensor device and a calm, methodical air. He greeted her briefly, then set to work, running the scanner along the wall. After a few passes, the device emitted a faint beep. He frowned and did it again. "There's current running through here," he said. "Low voltage, but constant." He moved further down the wall, and the beeping grew stronger. "There's more than one wire." He paused and looked at the officer. "You'll want to see this." They removed a section of the paneling near the floor, exposing a cluster of thin cables, all running vertically along the studs. The cables were old, coated in dust, but several had fresh cuts and splices, shiny copper visible where the insulation had been stripped away. Nia stared, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. It wasn't just one wire, it was a network. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. The technician shook his head. "Could be part of an old alarm or intercom system," he said slowly, "but someone's been working on it recently. These splices are new." The officer took photos with his phone. "We'll need to report this," he said, glancing at her. "You mentioned your landlord hasn't been in touch." Nia nodded mutely. The officer's expression hardened. "We'll find out who has access to this building. In the meantime, try to stay somewhere else tonight." The suggestion hit her like a blow. Stay somewhere else. Leave her apartment. The only place she had left that was hers, however tainted it had become. But even as panic rose, she knew he was right. Something was happening here that she couldn't face alone. After they left, the apartment seemed emptier than ever. The open panel gaped like a wound, wires curling out of it like veins. She sat on the floor beside it, staring into the darkness behind the wall. Part of her wanted to rip them all out, to tear the room apart until she reached the end of the line and found whoever had done this. But fear held her still. If someone had gone to the trouble of installing these wires, what else had they hidden? How long had they been listening? That night, she couldn't bring herself to leave, despite the officer's warning. The idea of being alone outside, of walking through the city with the knowledge that someone might be watching, terrified her even more. So she stayed, locking every door and window, turning on all the lights. The apartment glowed like a beacon against the darkness, fragile and exposed. Around midnight, the hum began again, faint but unmistakable. She moved to the bathroom doorway and listened. The wires in the open panel shimmered faintly in the light, and she could hear a soft crackle, like static on an untuned radio. It rose, fell, then stopped. She took a step closer. The air felt charged, humming against her skin. Then came a single click from the tank, clear as a breath. It was followed by another from behind the wall, almost like an answer. She backed away, trembling. The conversation she had imagined for nights was suddenly real. A question and an answer, a pattern between her and the thing inside the wall. She fled to the living room, clutching her phone, but she didn't call anyone. Who would believe that the wires were talking back? When morning came, she found muddy footprints on the hallway floor near the bathroom door. They were faint, smeared as though someone had walked through water. Her mind searched for a rational explanation. The officers, perhaps, or the technician, but these prints were too small, too narrow, as if made by bare feet. She crouched down, tracing one with her fingertip. It was damp, as though fresh. Then she heard it again, from inside the bathroom, a soft, deliberate scrape. She ran. Outside, the air was blindingly bright after the dimness of her apartment. She didn't stop walking until she reached the end of the block. Her hands shook as she tried to call the officer who had helped her, but the call went to voicemail. She left a message, disjointed, panicked words about the footprints, the noise, the wire. Then she stood there on the sidewalk, staring up at the building that had once felt like safety. From the street, it looked perfectly ordinary, its windows reflecting the sunlight, its brick facade warm and still. No one passing by would ever guess what lived behind those walls. By afternoon, the officer returned her call. He sounded calm, reassuring. He told her a full team would inspect the apartment the next day. "Don't go back there tonight," he said firmly. "Stay with someone." But she had no one nearby, no friend or family she could impose on. She promised to find a motel, though she knew she wouldn't. When the call ended, she stood there for a long time, watching the people move past her, each face anonymous, each expression indifferent. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw a man standing across the street, half in shadow, watching her. He wore a gray jacket and a cap pulled low, his posture too still, too deliberate. When a car passed between them, he was gone. That evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, Nia returned to her apartment despite every warning. The door was just as she'd left it, the lock unbroken. Inside, the lights she had left on still burned, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. She stepped into the bathroom, her body trembling with anticipation. The open panel yawned beside her, the wires glistening faintly in the artificial light. She crouched and listened. The hum had stopped. Everything was silent. She waited for the click, for the whisper, for any sign of movement. Nothing came. After a while, she stood and lowered the lid of the tank gently back into place. The porcelain settled with a soft thud that seemed to close a chapter. She should have felt relief, but instead there was only emptiness, a hollow quiet that rang louder than any noise. Still, as she turned to leave, her gaze caught the small dark hole where the wire had disappeared into the wall. Something about it seemed deeper now, as if it led not just through the building, but somewhere beyond, somewhere she could never follow. She switched off the light and stepped into the hallway, telling herself she would wait for the investigators in the morning. But as she lay in bed that night, listening to the hum of the city outside, she couldn't stop hearing it. The faint, steady clicking that came from the pipes, patient and alive, waiting for her to listen again. When the investigators arrived the next morning, the world outside was washed in a pale, uncertain light. A thin drizzle coated the streets, and the gray sky seemed to press down on the building like a heavy lid. Nia waited in the hallway, her hands twisting nervously, as the officers and technicians carried in their equipment. They moved through her apartment with quiet efficiency, setting up devices she didn't recognize, wires snaking across her floor, metal cases clicking open and shut. It should have been a comfort to see professionals at work, but the sight filled her with a new kind of dread. Whatever they were looking for, she knew deep down they would find it. She led them to the bathroom where the panel still gaped open and the dark wires glistened faintly behind the wall. One of the men crouched down and examined them with a small flashlight. "These are recent installations," he said, his voice clipped and professional. "Not part of the original structure." Another man, older, ran a handheld scanner over the wall. The machine emitted a soft chirp, and a string of numbers appeared on its small display. "Signal activity confirmed," he said. "There's a live current here, very weak but continuous. Could be transmitting data." The words made her skin crawl. She stood back, pressing her arms to her chest, watching as the two men worked in silence. They spoke in technical terms she couldn't follow, their voices calm, detached, while inside her heart pounded so loudly she was sure they could hear it. The younger officer, the one who had visited her before, glanced over his shoulder at her. "You did the right thing calling us," he said softly. "If someone's tampered with your wiring, we'll find out who." She nodded, though her throat was too tight to speak. They worked for nearly an hour, tracing the wires through the bathroom wall and into the adjacent corridor. The cables ran down behind the plumbing, snaking into the floor, disappearing beneath the tiles. The technicians used small drills to widen the opening, careful not to damage the structure. Nia stood in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself, her bare feet cold against the floor. When the first piece of the tile gave way, the sound that escaped from the cavity was not what she expected. It wasn't the dull clatter of falling debris, but a low, hollow resonance, like air moving through an open space. One of the men leaned closer, shining his light into the dark. "There's an access channel down here," he said. "Looks like a maintenance shaft. Runs under the building." A maintenance shaft. The words echoed through her mind like a warning. Someone had been crawling beneath her home, threading wires through the pipes and walls, working unseen in the dark. She pictured it too vividly. The quiet scraping she had heard at night, the sound of metal against concrete. It hadn't been imagination. Someone had been there all along. The officers decided to investigate further. One of them left to fetch a small camera mounted on a flexible cord, a tool used to inspect tight spaces. While they waited, the others continued widening the opening. Dust filled the air, mingling with the faint metallic smell of damp concrete. Nia felt lightheaded, as though the air itself had grown thinner. When the camera finally arrived, they fed the cord through the gap, the small lens glowing with white light. The live feed appeared on a handheld monitor. For a moment, the screen showed only darkness. Then the image shifted. Rough concrete, damp stains, and in the corner, something metallic glinting under the beam. "Zoom in," one of the men said. The technician adjusted the controls and the image sharpened. A cluster of wires, bundled together with black tape, extended along the wall of the shaft. They weren't part of any plumbing or power system. They ran with purpose, each one cleanly installed, anchored by small clips. The camera followed the line deeper, turning around a corner. Then it stopped. A shape appeared in the light, rectangular, with small switches and a blinking indicator. "Looks like a transmitter," the older technician said. "Some kind of relay node." He exchanged a glance with the officer. Definitely not legal. Nia's stomach turned. The word transmitter echoed in her head like a verdict. Someone had been using her apartment as part of a surveillance network. She could feel the walls closing in, the air thick with the weight of all the unseen eyes and ears that had been fixed on her. The officers made a call, speaking in low voices. Within an hour, more vehicles arrived outside, the letters FBI printed on their sides. Men and women in dark jackets filled the narrow hallway, their presence both reassuring and terrifying. They questioned Nia carefully, asking when she had first heard the noises, when she had discovered the wire, if she had noticed anyone suspicious in the building. She answered as best she could, her voice unsteady, her thoughts fragmented. She mentioned the landlord, his evasive tone, his sudden silence after she had called about the repairs. The agents exchanged brief looks, jotting down notes. Soon they began searching the rest of the building. They spoke to neighbors, examined the basement, traced the network of cables that had spread like veins through the old structure. As the hours passed, Nia sat on her couch, staring at her hands. Every so often, she heard footsteps in the hallway, voices murmuring, the creak of floorboards above her. She imagined the building being peeled open layer by layer, revealing all the secrets hidden within its walls. By late afternoon, one of the agents returned to her apartment. He was tall, with sharp features and an expression that revealed nothing. "Miss Hudson," he said quietly, "we found something." She followed him downstairs to the basement, her heart hammering. The air grew colder as they descended. The space below the building was larger than she had imagined, a low-ceilinged maze of pipes, old brick, and damp concrete. Portable lights cast harsh white circles against the walls. In the center of the room stood a folding table cluttered with equipment. Monitors, cables, recording devices. The faint hum of power filled the space. One of the agents adjusted a dial and the nearest monitor flickered to life. Static filled the screen, then resolved into a grainy image, the inside of her bathroom seen from above. Nia froze. The view was unmistakable. She could see the top of the toilet tank, the pattern of the cracked tiles, the edge of her shower curtain. How? The word caught in her throat. She couldn't finish it. "The wires you found were part of this setup," the agent said. "The camera was hidden inside the plumbing system. Whoever installed it used the pipes as conduits to disguise the signal." Her knees almost gave way. She gripped the edge of a nearby shelf to steady herself. "So, someone has been watching?" "Yes," he said softly, "and recording. For quite some time by the look of it." She felt the world tilt around her. Her apartment, her sanctuary, her last piece of safety, had been nothing but a stage, every private moment exposed. The thought made her nauseous. She turned away from the monitor, unable to look. The agent placed a hand on her shoulder, firm but careful. "We're going to find who did this." The investigation stretched into the evening. They followed the cables from the table to a narrow passageway at the far end of the basement. The tunnel was lined with old electrical conduits and dripping pipes, and it led to a locked door that looked as though it hadn't been opened in years. One of the agents picked the lock, and the hinges groaned as the door swung open. Beyond it was a small room, barely large enough to stand in. The air was damp and stale. Inside, illuminated by the beam of a flashlight, sat a single metal chair, a sleeping bag, and more equipment, an array of recorders, hard drives, and a small laptop. On the wall, pinned among faded maintenance charts, were several printed photographs. At first, Nia thought they were random images, but then she saw herself in them. Some were recent, her entering the apartment, standing by the window, walking down the street with her grocery bags. Others were older, grainier, taken from angles she didn't recognize. Her body went cold. They found the man later that night. He was discovered in an abandoned maintenance corridor connected to the neighboring building, hiding behind a pile of old crates. His clothes were filthy, his hair unkempt, his face pale in the harsh light of the agent's flashlights. When they pulled him out, Nia saw that he wasn't some faceless monster from a nightmare, but an ordinary-looking man in his 50s with tired eyes and trembling hands. He didn't resist. He only kept mumbling something under his breath, words that made no sense until he looked up at her and whispered, "You were the only one who noticed." The agents led him away, his wrists bound, his head bowed. Later, she learned his name. He had once worked for the company that managed the building's security systems, a technician with access to maintenance records, familiar with every wire and pipe. After being fired years earlier for unauthorized work, he had simply never left. He had lived in the basements and tunnels, surviving off stolen food and isolation, obsessively rebuilding the old wiring network into a personal labyrinth of surveillance. For years, he had watched the tenants come and go, listening through the pipes, collecting hours of footage for reasons no one could quite understand. Nia listened to the agent's explanations as though from a great distance. The words drifted past her, hollow and unreal. He installed microphones in several units, one of them said, used the plumbing to carry sound from the apartments. It's rare, but not impossible. The heat and moisture make it an ideal environment for certain equipment. The recordings we found go back months, maybe years. She felt sick. Months. The thought that every conversation, every private moment, had been captured and stored somewhere filled her with a horror that words could not contain. The agents tried to reassure her, promising that the footage would be confiscated, that she would not be in danger anymore. But their voices sounded distant, as if coming from the end of a long tunnel. When they finally let her return upstairs, it was nearly dawn. The apartment was quiet again, the hum gone, the wires severed, but the silence felt wrong, too deep, too absolute. She stood in the doorway of her bathroom, staring at the empty space where the tank had been removed. The tiles were cracked, the wall gouged open, exposing the dark cavity beyond. For a moment, she thought she heard something faint. Just the settling of the pipes, perhaps, or the echo of her imagination. But when she leaned closer, the sound was gone. The agents packed up their equipment and left, leaving behind only dust and the faint smell of ozone. Nia sat on her couch, watching the first light of morning creep across the floor. The nightmare was supposed to be over, but it didn't feel that way. The apartment no longer belonged to her. It was a crime scene now, a hollow shell that held the ghosts of every moment she had been watched. She thought of the man's words, "You were the only one who noticed," and felt a chill run through her. When she finally stood to close the blinds, her reflection caught in the window pane. For a fleeting instant, she thought she saw movement behind her, a shadow in the bathroom doorway. She turned quickly, heart hammering. There was nothing there, only the gaping hole in the wall, silent and black. Yet, as she stood there, the faintest sound rose once more from the pipes, so soft it could have been mistaken for the sigh of air. It lasted only a second, then vanished into the silence. She told herself it was just the house settling, a trick of the mind. But when she went to bed that morning, she left the bathroom light on just as she had on her first night in the apartment. The faint glow spilled across the hallway floor, a thin line of safety she could cling to in the dark, and though she closed her eyes, she didn't sleep. somewhere deep inside the walls, she thought she could still hear it. The faint, rhythmic click of something that refused to die. The days after the arrest blurred together, indistinct and heavy, as if time itself had thickened inside the walls of the apartment. Nia stayed in a small hotel on the other side of the city, a bland place with soft carpets, a muted television, and the constant hum of traffic outside the window. The noise of the city, honking cars, voices, the rhythm of life, had once irritated her, but now it was the only sound she could bear. Silence had become her enemy. Every moment of quiet carried an echo of those nights back in the apartment, when the stillness had been punctured by soft, deliberate clicks. She had thought she would feel free once the man was caught, that the fear would vanish with his arrest. But freedom turned out to be a fragile, haunted thing. Even here, surrounded by strangers, she kept glancing at the corners of the ceiling, half expecting to see the glint of a hidden lens. She tried to return to work, telling herself that routine would anchor her. But in the fluorescent-lit office, the buzz of conversation and the tapping of keyboards felt distant, unreal. Her colleagues spoke to her with careful sympathy, their smiles tentative, their eyes full of questions they didn't ask. She could tell they had heard something, rumors, fragments of the story that had already begun to circulate online. The news had picked it up briefly. Former technician arrested in apartment surveillance case. The article had mentioned no names, but it was enough for people to guess. The whispers followed her down the hall, though no one said anything directly. She could feel herself shrinking beneath their gaze, becoming smaller each day. At night, she dreamed of the apartment. In her dreams, the rooms were darker than she remembered, the walls pulsing faintly as if alive. The bathroom was always the same, its door half open, a line of light spilling across the floor. She would approach it slowly, knowing she shouldn't, but unable to stop herself. When she pushed the door open, the toilet lid would rise, and inside, instead of water, she would see an eye staring back at her, unblinking. She always woke just before it blinked. These dreams left her trembling, her pulse racing, the sheets damp with sweat. She tried to tell herself it was only trauma, that the mind had strange ways of keeping its scars alive. But some nights, even awake, she thought she could hear faint noises in the hotel bathroom, the soft, steady hum of plumbing, the faint tick of unseen mechanisms. A few weeks passed before the authorities allowed her to return to the apartment to collect her things. She considered refusing, telling them to keep everything, but there were documents she needed, and part of her felt a grim obligation to face it one last time. She arrived early in the morning, accompanied by an agent who stood quietly in the doorway while she packed. The rooms smelled of dust and disinfectant. Most of the furniture had been moved during the investigation, leaving the place bare and hollow. The bathroom door stood ajar. She couldn't help but look inside. The wall where the tank had been was still open, the hole patched temporarily with plywood. The mirror had been removed, leaving a pale square on the wall. She felt an ache of recognition, a strange nostalgia for the very place that had destroyed her sense of safety. The silence in that room felt heavier than ever, not peaceful, but watchful, as though the space itself remembered. She left with 2 suitcases and didn't look back until she reached the street. The building loomed behind her, its brick facade unremarkable, its windows blank. She wondered how many people walked past it every day without knowing what had been hidden inside. She thought of the man who had lived in the basements, how ordinary he had looked when they led him away in handcuffs. There had been no hatred in his face, only a kind of weary fascination, as if he had been part of the building itself. Sometimes, in her darker moments, she wondered if he had truly acted alone. The network of wires had been too elaborate, too deliberate. It had felt like something more than obsession, like a system built to outlast one man. When she moved into a new apartment across town, she told herself this time would be different. The building was modern, the walls bright and smooth, the plumbing new. The landlord gave her a tour, proudly showing her the smart thermostat, the reinforced locks, the state-of-the-art ventilation system. Nia smiled and nodded, but when he left, she walked from room to room in silence, pressing her hands against every wall, listening. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint whir of the ceiling fan, each sound made her tense. She checked under the sinks, behind the toilet, inside the light fixtures. Only when she found nothing did she allow herself to breathe. Still, that night she couldn't sleep without leaving the bathroom light on, just as she had before. The line of light stretching across the floor was her fragile reassurance that the dark corners of the world stayed where they belonged. Days became weeks. She began therapy at the insistence of her doctor, attending sessions twice a week in a quiet office that smelled of lavender and books. The therapist, a calm woman with gray eyes, listened without judgment as Nia recounted everything. The first strange noises, the disbelief, the wire, the police, the discovery in the basement. Speaking about it out loud felt like walking barefoot over broken glass, painful but necessary. Your body learned to live in fear, the therapist said once, her voice soft. It takes time to teach it peace again. Nia nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed that peace was something one could relearn. She had spent too long listening for danger to ever stop listening completely. Sometimes, in moments of exhaustion, she wondered what had driven him, the man in the basement, to build his web of wires. Loneliness? Curiosity? Control? She thought of his words, the ones that haunted her more than any sound. You were the only one who noticed. Had he meant it as admiration or accusation? Maybe both. She didn't want to understand him, but part of her couldn't stop trying. She pictured him sitting down there in the dark, headphones pressed to his ears, listening to the intimate sounds of people living above him, the hum of their conversations, the rhythm of their laughter, the flush of their toilets. What had he been looking for in all that noise? What did he hear that made him stay? The thought made her stomach twist. By early spring, she began to rebuild something that resembled a routine. She returned to work part-time, started cooking again, even met with friends for coffee. But small habits lingered. She avoided bathrooms in public places, flinched when faucets gurgled, and never used the toilet without first lifting the lid to check. She told no one about this ritual. It was her secret way of asserting control, of proving to herself that she was still aware, still vigilant. Yet, each time she performed it, she felt the echo of her old fears stir inside her, like a whisper reminding her that safety was an illusion. Then, one quiet evening, as she sat reading in her new living room, a faint sound drifted through the walls. It was soft, barely audible, but unmistakable, a short, dry click, followed by a pause, then another. Her heart froze. For a moment, she couldn't move. The book slid from her lap onto the carpet. She told herself it was the building settling, or perhaps someone next door. But the rhythm was too precise. It came again and again, at perfectly even intervals. She stood slowly, her pulse pounding, and turned toward the bathroom door. The light was on, casting its familiar line of gold across the floor. The sound seemed to come from beyond it, muted but clear. She walked closer, each step deliberate, until she stood before the door. The clicks stopped. She reached for the handle but couldn't bring herself to touch it. Then, from behind the door, came a faint hiss, like the release of air from a valve. The same sound she had once heard from the tank in the old apartment. She stayed there for what felt like an eternity, listening, waiting. The hiss faded into silence. Finally, she took a deep breath and opened the door. The bathroom was empty, ordinary, untouched. The light glared against the white tiles, the air warm and still. Nothing was wrong. And yet, as she stood there, a strange calm settled over her. Not relief exactly, but resignation. Maybe the noise had been her imagination. Or maybe it hadn't. It didn't matter anymore. The fear would always live somewhere inside her, as much a part of her as breath. The man had been caught, the wires removed, the walls repaired, but what he had left behind was invisible, woven into her nerves and her memory. That night, she couldn't sleep again. She sat by the window, watching the street lights flicker on and off, thinking about how easily people trusted the spaces they lived in. They believed their homes were private, that walls protected them, that silence was a kind of safety. She had believed it, too, once. Now she knew better. Silence was never empty. It was full of the echoes of everything unseen. Around midnight, rain began to fall, soft and steady, and she listened to it until her eyes closed from exhaustion. Weeks later, she returned to the old neighborhood one last time. The building still stood, though parts of it were under renovation. Workers moved in and out, carrying boxes of tiles and coils of new electrical wire. She watched them from across the street, feeling an odd mix of anger and pity. The windows she had once stared out of now reflected only the pale light of afternoon. No one would ever know what had happened there. Not really. The story had already begun to fade, replaced by new tenants, new lives, new secrets. She thought of walking away and never coming back, but before she left she wanted to see the basement. She told herself it was for closure, though she wasn't sure she believed it. One of the workers let her in. The basement was brighter now, the walls freshly painted, the floors swept clean. The air no longer smelled of damp metal. The table where the equipment had stood was gone, and the corner where the hidden room had been sealed shut with new concrete. But as she walked across the floor, she noticed something faint beneath her feet, a rhythmic vibration, subtle but steady. It was probably just machinery, she told herself, some part of the building's new electrical system. Yet, as she stood there, the rhythm changed, forming a pattern she almost recognized, a series of short pulses followed by one long. Her chest tightened. She backed away slowly and left without speaking. That night, she dreamed of water again, the steady trickle through pipes, the sound of whispers behind the walls. But in the dream, she didn't run or hide. She stood in the middle of the room, listening. The fear was still there, but it was quieter now, shaped into something she could live with. When she woke, the room was filled with morning light. The world outside was alive with noise, birds, traffic, voices, and for the first time in months, she let the sound fill her without flinching. Still, before leaving for work, she walked into the bathroom. The light was on. The mirror reflected her face, calm but alert, eyes steady. She turned toward the toilet, lifted the lid, and stared for a long moment into the still water. Nothing moved. No hum, no click. She let out a slow breath, closed the lid gently, and whispered to the empty room, "Not today." Then she turned off the light and left for work, the faint echo of her words following her into the hallway, dissolving into the endless hum of the city that, unlike silence, never truly slept. If this story kept you watching till the end, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We've got more unbelievable true stories coming your way. Don't stop here. Check out the next video on your screen. You won't believe how it ends. And share this one with your friends. Let them see what really hides behind ordinary walls.